The three men pushed old Jim against his vegetable stand, sending carrots and tomatoes rolling into the dust. It was a quiet afternoon on the country road, with only the sound of cicadas and distant farm machinery breaking the silence. The tallest one, wearing a leather jacket despite the summer heat, grabbed a handful of Jim's shirt. "Protection money's due, old-timer. Price went up this month." "That's how business works," he sneered, while his two friends laughed and kicked over a basket of fresh corn. Jim's weathered hands trembled as he steadied himself against the wooden stand. At 72, he was too old for this kind of trouble. These boys had been terrorizing local businesses for months, and nobody could stop them. "I barely make enough to keep the farm running," Jim said softly, his voice shaking. "Please, just leave an old man be." "Wrong answer," the leader growled, pulling back his fist. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The quiet voice came from behind them. The three men turned to see a figure standing in the dusty driveway. He wore muddy work boots and faded jeans, his hands dirty from working in the fields. Nothing special about him, just another farmer's boy. He wasn't particularly big or threatening looking. But something in his eyes made them pause. The leader recovered quickly, letting go of Jim's shirt. "Well, look who it is. Jimmy's little boy, back from playing soldier. This ain't your business, boy. Walk away while you can still walk." The son took one step forward, and despite themselves, the three men took one step back. There was something about the way he moved, smooth, controlled, like a coiled spring. "Last chance," the son said quietly. "Get in your truck and leave. Never come back. Never bother my father or anyone else in this town again." The leader's face turned red. "Nobody talks to me like that." He charged forward, fist raised. The son didn't seem to move at all. But somehow, in the blink of an eye, the leader was face down in the dirt, arm bent at an angle that made his friends' faces go pale. He wasn't screaming, he couldn't seem to find the breath. As the other two reached for the knives they carried, the son's small, terrifying smile stopped them cold. They suddenly remembered the rumors about where he'd really been these past few years. Not just a soldier, something else. Something that explained the way he moved, the look in his eyes, and why their tough guy leader was whimpering in the dirt. "Your choice, gentlemen," he said softly. "But I should warn you, I've had a lot of practice dealing with much scarier people than you." The bullies looked at their fallen leader, then at the quiet man standing ready in the dust. They made their choice. This was the day everything changed in their small town. And it was only the beginning. Part 2, The Return. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Richardson family farm as Tom worked alongside his father Jim, just like he had before his 8 years of service. The familiar scent of fresh-turned earth and growing things helped ease the memories that still haunted his nights. 3 weeks had passed since his return, and he was slowly finding his rhythm in civilian life again. "Hand me that wrench, son," Jim asked as he worked on the old tractor. Tom passed it over, noting how his father's hands shook slightly. Age was catching up with the old man, though he'd never admit it. The last few years had been hard on him, running the farm alone while Tom was away serving with the SEALs. "Local boys been giving you trouble long?" Tom asked casually, though he'd been piecing things together since his return. The way his father tensed at unexpected sounds. The nervous glances toward the road. The missing equipment from the barn. Jim's shoulders slumped slightly. Started about 2 years back. Just 3 of them at first, asking for protection money from local businesses. Police can't do much, no proof, and folks are scared to talk. He wiped his hands on a rag, avoiding his son's eyes. They caught old Pete Wilson alone in his hardware store last month. Beat him pretty bad. Tom nodded slowly, his mind automatically cataloging threats and analyzing patterns, just like his training taught him. The tall one, their leader, he's got a military tattoo. Dishonorable discharge, I'm guessing. The way he moves, he's had some training, but he's sloppy now. Overconfident. They've got half the county afraid to open their businesses, Jim continued. Sheriff Thompson tries, but he's got no deputies, no budget. Times are hard enough without these vultures circling. Tom watched a hawk soaring overhead, remembering similar birds in different skies, over different battles. Small-town bullies aren't so different from the other kinds I've dealt with, Dad. They prey on fear. Take away the fear, they're nothing. Later that afternoon, Tom drove into town for supplies. Main Street told its own story, empty storefronts, nervous glances, conversations that stopped when strangers walked by. Outside the diner, he spotted Mrs. Chen sweeping her sidewalk. Her daughter Jenny had been in his class at school. The restaurant windows were boarded up on one side. "Rock through the window last week," Mrs. Chen explained when she saw him looking. "They said it was just kids, but—" She shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. At the hardware store, Pete Wilson was back at work, but the bruises were still visible on his face. He straightened up when he saw Tom, recognition and something like hope flickering in his eyes. "Heard you were back," he said quietly. "Your dad must be glad." Tom gathered his supplies, listening as Pete nervously chatted about local happenings. "Heard you were back," he said quietly. "Your dad must be glad." Tom gathered his supplies, listening as Pete nervously chatted about local happenings. The pattern was clear. The three men had started small, but their demands and violence were escalating. They had connections in neighboring counties, hints of bigger organizations backing them. The local people were isolated, scared, losing hope. Driving home, Tom passed their black pickup truck parked outside the bar. He noted the license plate automatically, caught glimpses of faces through the window. The leader, Ray Stevens, he'd learned, was laughing about something. 8 years ago, Tom might have rushed in, tried to solve things with fists and fury. But the SEALs had taught him patience, strategy, the importance of gathering intelligence before acting. That evening, as crickets chirped and fireflies danced in the gathering dusk, Tom sat on the porch with his father. Jim was talking about crop rotation and rainfall patterns, normal farming concerns, but his eyes kept drifting to the road. "We're not alone, Dad," Tom said finally. "The whole town's in this together, they just don't know it yet. Sometimes people need someone to remind them how to stand up." Jim looked at his son, really looked at him, for the first time since his return. "You're not the angry boy who left here, Tom. War changes people, they say." Tom smiled slightly. "It does. Sometimes it teaches you when not to fight. And sometimes it teaches you exactly how to fight the battles that need fighting." A car passed on the distant road, and both men tensed slightly until it was gone. The sun set over their fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, of watching, of waiting. The time would come for action, but not yet. For now, Tom Richardson sat with his father in the gathering dark, planning how to take back their town one careful step at a time. Sheriff Thompson sat in his small office, looking at the photos spread across his desk while Tom Richardson stood quietly by the window. Pictures of smashed store windows, burned farm equipment, bruised faces, a timeline of fear written in violence and broken glass. "Been collecting these for months," Thompson said, running a hand through his graying hair. "But without witnesses willing to testify." He shrugged helplessly. "Ray Stevens and his boys are careful. Always have alibis at the bar. Always somebody willing to swear they were somewhere else when trouble happened." Tom picked up one photo, the burned-out shell of a delivery truck. "Jeff Miller's truck?" "Yeah. Right after he refused to use their security company for his deliveries. Insurance called it electrical failure." Thompson's face tightened. "Jeff sold his business next week. moved to Ohio with his family. Through the window, Tom watched people hurrying along Main Street, heads down, moving quickly past certain stores. Like people he'd seen in war zones, trying to become invisible. 8 businesses had closed in the past year. 5 families had moved away. The heart was being squeezed out of their town one squeeze at a time. Stevens has connections, Thompson continued. Phone calls I've traced to Chicago. Money moving through accounts I can't access without warrants. This isn't just 3 local boys anymore. They're part of something bigger. Tom nodded slowly. He'd seen similar patterns before, in different places. They're testing the waters. If they can take control here, they'll expand to other small towns. Nobody notices when rural communities disappear one by one. A knock at the door made both men turn. Linda Weber from the bank stood there, eyes red from crying. "Sheriff, they came to the bank this morning. Said they need a business loan. Said if we don't approve it by Friday." Her voice broke. Thompson cursed softly. "Linda, I can put a deputy - you have 2 deputies for the whole county," she interrupted. "And my daughter's starting college next month. I can't." She wiped her eyes. "I just thought you should know." After she left, silence filled the office. Thompson looked at Tom. "Your dad told me what happened at the produce stand. Said you handled them pretty clean." "That was just a warning," Tom replied. "They'll be back. Bullies always come back harder unless you stop them completely." "I've got no resources, Tom. County budgets cut to the bone. State police have bigger problems in the cities. FBI won't touch it without solid evidence of interstate crime." Tom gathered the photos into a neat pile. "Sometimes official channels aren't the answer, Sheriff. Sometimes communities have to remember how to stand together." That evening, Tom sat in his truck outside Riley's bar, watching. Stevens and his 2 friends spent every evening there, holding court like small-town kings. Other locals came and went, laughing too loud at their jokes, buying them drinks, the tribute fear demands. But Tom saw other things too. The way old Bill Hayes from the feed store clenched his fists under the table while pretending to smile. The cold hatred in Jenny Chen's eyes as she served them drinks. The quiet conversations in corners, quickly hushed when the wrong people came near. The fear was real, but underneath it, anger was building. Anger just needed direction. Purpose. A spark. Tom started his truck, mind already working on plans. Tomorrow he'd talk to Hayes, then Wilson at the hardware store. Linda at the bank. The Chen family. Others who'd been hurt, who'd lost things, who were tired of being afraid. One conversation at a time. One connection at a time. His SEAL training had taught him that the strongest weapon against evil wasn't guns or fists, it was communities standing together. Fear could strangle a town slowly, but courage was contagious. Hope was contagious. And Tom Richardson had learned a lot about how to spread hope in dark places. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The sound of shattering glass at Wilson's hardware store split the sleepy air like a thunderclap. Tom was across the street at the post office when he heard old Pete Wilson's voice rise in panic. "Please, not that. Those are my father's tools, they're all I have left of him." Tom moved silently to the store's side window. Inside, Stevens and his 2 friends were systematically destroying the vintage tool collection Pete's father had spent a lifetime building. Beautiful old hand planes and chisels, each one lovingly restored, crashed against walls and floor. "Should have paid on time, old man," Stevens laughed, swinging a 100-year-old hammer into the display case. "Maybe next month you'll remember who runs things around here." The smaller bully, Dexter, had Pete pinned against the counter. The third one, Cooper, was filming everything on his phone, probably for sending messages to other businesses about what happened to people who didn't cooperate. Tom watched Pete's face crumple as another family heirloom shattered. The old man's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Something deep inside Tom's chest shifted, the quiet, cold place his SEAL training had built for moments when emotions needed to be set aside. "Hey Wilson, maybe we should start on your fingers next," Stevens grinned, picking up a pair of pliers. "Bit harder to run a hardware store with Dash," the back door chime jingled. All heads turned to see Tom standing there, still in his farm work clothes. His boots left dusty prints on the clean floor as he walked slowly forward. "3 men against an old-timer," Tom said quietly. "Real brave." Stevens's face darkened. "Told you to stay out of our business, farm boy. Looks like you need another lesson." He nodded to Cooper, who set down his phone and moved to circle behind Tom. Dexter kept his grip on Pete but pulled out a switchblade. The message was clear, 3 against 1, and this time they were ready. Tom didn't move. His voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "Pete, walk out the front door. Go to the diner and call Sheriff Thompson. But Dash, now, please." Something in Tom's tone made Pete scramble away as soon as Dexter's grip loosened. The old man's footsteps faded quickly down the street. "Big mistake," Stevens snarled. "Nobody here to witness what happens to you now." Tom's small smile was the same one he'd worn in a dozen war zones. "Actually, I'm the one who made sure we're alone. Wouldn't want any civilians getting hurt." Before Stevens could respond, Tom's hand flicked out. The lights went dark. He'd pulled the main breaker by the door when he entered. In the sudden blackness, there was a soft whisper of movement, then the meaty sound of fist meeting flesh. When Pete returned with Sheriff Thompson 10 minutes later, they found the hardware store dark and quiet. The front door was locked. Thompson had to use his key to get in. They found Stevens and his friends tied up neatly with zip ties, looking considerably worse for wear. Cooper was mumbling something about ghosts and demons. Dexter just stared blankly ahead, shaking. Stevens's face was a mass of bruises, but he was conscious enough to start yelling about police brutality and lawsuits. Of Tom Richardson, there was no sign. Just some dusty boot prints and 3 thoroughly subdued bullies who seemed suddenly eager to talk to the police about their Chicago connections. That evening, as Tom helped his father with the evening chores, neither man mentioned the bruises on Tom's knuckles. But when Jim Richardson looked at his son, he saw something had changed. The patience was wearing thin. The gathering storm was about to break. Tom sat at his father's kitchen table early the next morning, sipping black coffee and reading a letter that had been slipped under their door overnight. His face remained calm, but his fingers tightened slightly on the paper. Jim watched his son from across the table, noting the subtle signs of tension he'd learned to recognize since Tom's return. "They're threatening to burn down the farm," Tom said finally, placing the letter carefully on the table. "Unless we pay them $50,000 by Friday. Seems they didn't appreciate yesterday's hardware store lesson." Jim's weathered hands gripped his coffee mug. "I've got maybe 8,000 in savings. Could sell the back 40 acres, but that'd take time." "We're not paying them, Dad." Tom folded the letter precisely, his movements controlled and deliberate. "This ends now." The morning sun streamed through the window as Tom explained his plan. Jim listened, occasionally nodding, seeing his quiet son transform into something else, the skilled tactician his years of service had created. This wasn't the angry young man who'd left for the military. This was someone who'd learned to channel anger into strategy. Later that morning, Tom drove into town. He parked his truck directly in front of Riley's bar, Stevens's usual hangout. Inside, the morning regulars fell silent as he walked to the bar where Stevens and his friends sat nursing their wounds from yesterday. "Private word?" Tom asked quietly. Stevens turned, his face still bruised and swollen. Got nothing to say to you. Actually, you do. Tom's voice carried across the silent bar. Because right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and some very serious trouble. Something in his tone made Stevens pause. After a moment, he followed Tom to a corner table. His two friends started to come along, but Tom's glance stopped them cold. Yesterday was a warning, Tom said once they were seated. A gentle one. Where I served, we had other ways of dealing with people who prey on the weak. Much less pleasant ways. Stevens tried to sneer, but it came out weak. You threatening me? After what you did yesterday, one phone call to my friends in Chicago - you mean the Cantelli crime family? Tom interrupted softly. Interesting choice of allies. See, during my service, I made some friends too. People who specialize in organized crime. Right now they're very interested in a small-time crew trying to expand into rural territories without permission. The color drained from Stevens's face. Here's what happens next, Tom continued. You and your friends leave town. Today. The protection money stops. The threats stop. You never contact your Chicago friends about this place. In exchange, certain photos and recordings don't find their way to some very dangerous people who don't like unauthorized expansion into their territory. You're bluffing, Stevens whispered, but his hands were shaking. Tom pulled out his phone, showed one photo. Stevens's eyes widened. That's Don Cantelli's daughter's wedding. How did you - like I said? I made friends during my service. Very well-connected friends. The kind who owe me favors. The kind who disapprove of small-time thugs using their name without permission. Tom stood up. You have until sundown. After that, things get complicated. And Stevens? He leaned down close. That farm-burning threat? Remember what happened to bullies who threatened my family in other places. Remember why I got those special friends. He walked out, leaving Stevens staring at nothing, face pale beneath the bruises. The morning sun felt warm on Tom's face as he crossed the street. Now came the waiting. Bullies had to make their own choices. But he'd learned that sometimes, the right kind of warning was better than any violence. His phone buzzed, a message from an unlisted number. His old commanding officer, confirming that certain surveillance photos had been received and shared with the right people. Everything was in motion. Tom drove home to help his father with the day's work. By sundown, they'd know if Stevens was smart enough to take the warning, or if things would have to get complicated. The sun was setting behind the Richardson farm when they heard the first trucks approaching. Tom, who'd been fixing the barn door, paused and listened to the familiar rumble of multiple vehicles moving fast down their country road. Dad, he called calmly, go inside and call Sheriff Thompson. Tell him it's starting. Jim looked at his son, seeing not the farmer but the warrior now. You knew they'd come. Bullies always do. Too proud to run, too scared to face things alone. Tom smiled slightly. Don't worry, Dad. We're not alone either. As Jim hurried inside, Tom watched 5 pickup trucks tear up their long driveway, dirt spraying behind them. He counted 12 men jumping out, Stevens and his 2 friends, plus 9 tough-looking strangers. Chicago muscle, probably, called in for one last desperate show of force. Nice night for a visit, Tom called out, staying by the barn. His voice carried across the yard, calm as a summer breeze. Stevens stepped forward, trying to hide his nervousness behind bravado. Think you're clever, don't you? Making threats, talking about connections? He gestured at his backup. Well, I've got real connections. These boys don't play games. Neither do I. Tom hadn't moved. Last chance to leave quietly. One of the Chicago men spat on the ground. Enough talk. Burn it all. They started spreading out, some carrying gas cans, others holding baseball bats and chains. Stevens pulled out a handgun, waving it wildly. "Not so tough now, are you, soldier boy?" A sharp whistle cut through the evening air. Suddenly, figures emerged from the shadows around the farm. Pete Wilson stepped out from behind a tractor, holding his father's old shotgun. Bill Hayes and his 3 sons appeared from the corn field, carrying rifles. Jenny Chen's brothers moved up from the creek bed. More townspeople materialized from the growing darkness, farmers, shopkeepers, mechanics, all armed, all wearing grim expressions. "See," Tom said conversationally, "while you were gathering your city friends, I was reminding our neighbors what community means." The Chicago thugs shifted uneasily, doing the math. They were professionals, but they were also outnumbered 2-to-1 by angry locals who knew every inch of this land. "You're making a big mistake," Stevens shouted, but his voice cracked. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Actually, we do." Sheriff Thompson's voice rang out as his cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. 2 more police cars appeared on the road. And thanks to an anonymous tip, so does the FBI's Organized Crime Division. Seems somebody provided them with some very interesting photos and recordings about unauthorized expansion plans. Tom watched calmly as the reality of their situation dawned on Stevens's face. The Chicago men were already backing toward their trucks, wanting no part of a federal investigation. Honor among thieves only went so far. "Your choice," Tom said quietly. "Surrender to local authorities now, or wait for the federal boys. They're about 20 minutes out, and they've got lots of questions about your Chicago friends." For a moment, the only sound was the evening wind in the corn. Then Stevens's gun hand dropped, and the fight went out of him all at once. His friends quickly followed suit. As Sheriff Thompson moved in with handcuffs, the townspeople kept their weapons ready but relaxed slightly. Tom caught Pete Wilson's eye and nodded. The old man smiled back, standing straighter than he had in years. The Chicago thugs peeled out in their trucks, leaving their would-be rural empire to crumble. Sometimes, Tom reflected, the biggest battles were won without firing a shot. Sometimes all it took was showing people they weren't alone. The night was heavy with tension. The farm stood in eerie silence, its fields bathed in the glow of the full moon. The son stood near the barn, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. He knew they were coming. He could feel it. The bullies had taken the bait. After their last encounter, their pride had been wounded. They couldn't let it go. They wanted revenge. But they had no idea what they were walking into. A truck's engine rumbled in the distance. The sound grew louder, tires crunching against the gravel road leading to the farm. Then another engine joined. And another. 3 vehicles, moving slow, lights off. The son exhaled. Right on time. From the farmhouse window, the old farmer watched. His fingers clenched the curtain, his heart pounding. He had always told his boy to avoid trouble, to walk away when possible. But tonight wasn't about picking a fight. Tonight was about protecting what was theirs. The truck stopped near the fence. Doors creaked open. Shadows moved under the moonlight. The bullies stepped out, their figures barely visible in the darkness. There were more of them this time. 6, maybe 7. The son could hear their hushed voices, the clinking of metal. They weren't here to talk. One of them, the leader, whispered a crude joke. The others chuckled. They thought this was going to be easy. They thought the farmer's boy was just another small-town nobody. They were wrong. The son stepped forward, boots firm on the ground. "Turn around," he called, his voice calm, steady. "You don't want this." Laughter. The leader took a step closer, twirling a metal bat. "That so?" he sneered. "Gonna run to daddy for help?" The son smiled. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down a man's spine. "Last chance," he said. "Go home." The leader growled. "Get him." The first two rushed in. They were fast, but not fast enough. The son ducked, sidestepped, and in one fluid motion, sent a precise strike to the first attacker's ribs. A grunt, then a sharp gasp as the man crumpled to the dirt. The second lunged with a knife. The son caught his wrist, twisted hard, and the blade clattered to the ground. A swift kick to the knee, a palm strike to the jaw, down he went. The others hesitated now. The leader's smirk faded. 3 seconds, the son warned, his voice lower this time. 1. A third man charged, swinging wildly. The son dodged left, caught the man's arm mid-swing, and drove his elbow into the attacker's chest. The man wheezed, collapsing. 2. A fourth man pulled a chain from his belt. He swung it in wide arcs, but the son remained still, watching, waiting. The moment the chain came too close, the son seized it, yanked hard, and sent its owner stumbling forward. A sharp strike to the back of the head and he was out cold. The leader stepped back, eyes darting to his fallen crew. He wasn't laughing anymore. His knuckles tightened around the bat. "You think you're tough?" he spat. The son tilted his head. "No," he said, stepping closer. "I know I am." The leader swung the bat. It cut through the air, aiming for the son's ribs. But he was too slow. The son sidestepped, caught the bat mid-swing, and ripped it from the man's hands. A quick jab to the gut sent the leader staggering back. He wheezed, doubling over. You can't," the son stepped in close, towering over him. "This is your last warning," he said, voice sharp as steel. "You leave this town alone. You don't come back. Ever." The leader nodded weakly, chest heaving. He had no fight left in him. Behind them, headlights appeared, blue and red flashing in the night. The sheriff's car pulled up, kicking dust into the air. 2 deputies stepped out, hands on their holsters. They took in the scene, the groaning men on the ground, the son standing tall. The sheriff met his eyes. He had known the farmer's boy since he was young. Had watched him grow. Had seen the medals when he returned home. "Looks like they had a rough night," the sheriff said. The son nodded. "They won't be back." The sheriff smirked. "I believe you." The deputies moved in, cuffing the moaning men, reading their rights. The leader sat slumped, hands on his knees, his fight gone. The old farmer stepped out from the house, his face lined with both worry and pride. He looked at his son, at the men being loaded into the police car, at the town that had just changed forever. The son dusted off his hands. "Let's go inside, Dad," he said. The dust settled over the farm as the sheriff's deputies loaded the last of the bullies into their vehicles. The leader, his face pale and bruised, slumped in the back of a patrol car, silent for the first time all night. The others sat beside him, groaning in pain, their arrogance shattered. The old farmer stood on the porch, watching. He had spent years worrying that his son's time in the military had hardened him, but tonight, he saw something else: discipline, restraint, and an unwavering sense of justice. His son could have broken those men beyond repair, but he hadn't. He had given them a choice. They had made the wrong one. The sheriff pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Well," he said, "I don't suppose they'll be causing any more trouble around here." The son nodded. "They got off easy." The sheriff glanced at the beaten men. "Easy?" He chuckled. "Son, they'll be waking up sore for the next week." His expression darkened. "But I know what you mean. If you wanted to, you could have put them in the hospital." The son met his gaze. "Not my style." The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded. He turned to one of his deputies. "Get statements from the farmer and his son. I want to make sure we have this all locked up tight." One by one, the deputies asked questions, writing down details. The son explained how the trouble had been brewing for a while. How the bullies had been terrorizing the town, attacking store owners, and getting away with it. "Well," the deputy said, closing his notebook, "they won't be getting away with it anymore." As the police cars pulled away, neighbors began to emerge. Word had spread fast. A small crowd gathered at the farm's entrance, local business owners, townsfolk, even the elderly store owner the bullies had attacked earlier that week. A middle-aged man stepped forward, removing his cap and twisting it in his hands. "We saw what happened," he said. "Heard the commotion. You took care of them." A woman nodded. "We were all scared. Those guys, no one dared stand up to them. But you did." The son folded his arms. "Wasn't just me. It was all of us." He looked at the crowd. "They were only strong because you let them be." An elderly woman stepped forward. "You're right. We should have done something sooner." The farmer, silent until now, placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes," he said, "it only takes one man to remind others how to stand tall." The son exhaled, glancing around at the familiar faces. Some looked ashamed, others relieved. But all of them stood together now, stronger than before. The following morning, the town was buzzing. The bullies had been taken to the county jail, awaiting trial. Charges were being filed: assault, vandalism, trespassing. Some of them had previous records. They wouldn't be seeing daylight for a long time. The newspaper ran a front-page article: "Local hero ends reign of terror, town stands united." The diner was filled with murmurs. Some folks read the article aloud, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others sat quietly, sipping coffee, reflecting on how they had let fear control them for so long. The sheriff made his rounds, assuring business owners that things were changing. "You got a problem," he told them, "you come to me. No more suffering in silence." At the hardware store, the old farmer picked up supplies, some fresh fencing, nails, and a new padlock for the barn. The owner, a stocky man with thick-rimmed glasses, refused to take his money. "This one's on me," he insisted. "Your boy did this town a favor." The farmer hesitated but nodded. "He just did what was right." Back at the farm, the son leaned against the wooden fence, watching the land stretch before him. It had been a long time since he felt this kind of peace. His father stepped up beside him. "Town's different now," he said. The son nodded. "Yeah. Maybe it was always waiting for someone to remind them how to fight back." The farmer chuckled. "Not sure they'll be needing you much longer." The son smirked. "That's the goal, isn't it?" His father studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're not planning to stay, are you?" The son looked out at the fields, at the rolling hills, the familiar dirt roads. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is home. But I spent so many years out there, training for fights I never wanted. It's hard to just stop." The farmer nodded. He had seen that restless energy in his son since the day he came back. "You don't have to stop," he said. "Just figure out what's worth fighting for." The son exhaled. Maybe his fight wasn't over. Maybe it had just changed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town rested easy for the first time in years. The fear that had once loomed over them was gone. Justice had been served, and a lesson had been learned. But for the son, the road wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. The farm had never felt this quiet. The tension that had once clouded the town was gone, replaced with something different: relief, maybe even hope. The son sat on the porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands as he watched the morning mist roll over the fields. His father sat beside him, sipping his own coffee, staring at the land they had both worked so hard to keep. It had been days since the confrontation, and the town was still talking about it. Everywhere they went, people offered handshakes, meals, and quiet words of gratitude. The fear that had once held the town hostage was gone. Justice had been served, and the people had learned that standing together was their greatest strength. The old farmer sighed, setting his cup down. "You know, I always told you not to fight," he said, his voice thoughtful. The son chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I remember." The farmer turned to face him. "But I see now, some fights need to happen. Not just with fists. Sometimes, people need a reminder of what's worth protecting." The son looked out at the horizon. "And sometimes," he said, "they just need someone to show them how." The old man nodded, a slow, proud smile crossing his weathered face. "You did that, son." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun rise. The farm felt different now, not just because the threat was gone, but because something had changed in both of them. The town transforms over the next few weeks. The town began to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. Businesses that had been too afraid to report crimes now stood tall. The sheriff had cracked down, ensuring trouble wouldn't return. The elderly store owner, the one who had been attacked, reopened with fresh shelves and a brand new sign. His grandson stood behind the counter now, keeping a watchful eye on things. At the diner, laughter replaced hushed whispers. People sat together, talking about things they had long ignored. How they had let fear control them, how they had turned a blind eye to the bullies' reign. The town had learned its lesson. They would never let it happen again. A decision to make one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the son walked along the fence line, running his fingers over the wooden posts. His father joined him, carrying a toolbox. "You've been quiet," the farmer said. The son exhaled. "I've been thinking." His father didn't say anything, just waited. "I don't know if I belong here," the son admitted. "The farm, the quiet life, it's peaceful. But after everything I've seen, everything I've done, I don't know if I can just settle down." The farmer nodded, as if he had expected this. "You've always been restless." The son smirked. "Takes one to know one." They both chuckled, then fell into silence again. The father looked out at the land. "You've done a lot of good here. Not just for me, but for the town. Maybe that's what you're meant to do." The son turned to him. "What do you mean?" The farmer shrugged. "Maybe there are other places, other towns, where people need someone like you. Not just to fight, but to show them how to stand up for themselves." The son considered this. He had always thought of his military training as something that set him apart, something that made him different. But maybe it was a gift, one he could use not just to fight, but to protect, to teach. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe you're right." His father smiled. "You'll figure it out. You always do." One last goodbye that night, the son packed a small bag. He wasn't leaving for good, at least, not yet. But he needed to see what else was out there, where he was truly needed. The next morning, as he prepared to leave, the town gathered at the farm. Men, women, and children stood by the road, some holding signs, others just standing in quiet appreciation. The sheriff stepped forward, offering his hand. "You ever need a place to come back to, you've got one here." The son shook his hand firmly. "Appreciate it." The elderly store owner stepped forward next. "You reminded us what it means to be strong. We won't forget that." The son nodded. "Good. Don't let anyone make you afraid again." Finally, his father approached. No long speech, no final words of wisdom, just a hug, strong and silent. "You take care of yourself, boy," the old man murmured. The son smirked. "I always do." With that, he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and gave one last wave before pulling onto the road. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The farm, the town, the people. They were all standing together, stronger than before. He didn't know exactly where the road would take him. But he knew one thing for certain. Wherever people needed someone to stand up for what was right, he would be there. And that was enough.